The static really sticks on. So for those of us who have been a part of the church for any while, if I was to ask you, what does 1 Peter chapter 5, verses 1 through 3 say? And even if you couldn't quote it, if I started to say the words, so I exhort the elders among you and such, a lot of you would be able to say that it talks about the shepherds shepherding the flock of God that is among you, and you got to emphasize the among you, and not lording it over, and so forth. And so Stan read for us that context there of that paragraph of verses. And the elders are probably thinking, oh, great, here we go, talking about this. But then, if I asked what the couple of verses after those instructions to the elders say, I suspect there would be a lot fewer of us who would be able to say what it is that they tell us. That probably says something. We have this focus on, certain aspects like that of, I exhort the elders among you in the particulars about their oversight and what they're supposed to do. But what Peter's presenting us with here is a balance of different roles and responsibilities. And they talk about humility and submission for all of us. And submission is a dirty word. In our culture, that is that thing that's associated with oppression or weakness, being less than, and submission to different kinds of authority and things. We don't like that. We don't want to talk about being submitted to anything or be submissive, but submission to different kinds of authority or deference to other people is something that we're commanded to have very often. And if we only talk about the directives to the elders in the first few verses here, verses 1 through 3, then we lose the balance that's intended by this passage to help us all live together in humble harmony. So I hope you recognize that what Stan read for us is not just addressed to the elders. But there's another part that we don't talk about as often, I believe. So the flow of the passage is, if you look at chapter 4 and verse 19, where it's sort of ending the thought there, that those who are entrusting themselves to a faithful Creator while suffering, they need to be led. And so the elders are to shepherd the people in the right way, according to verses 1 through 3, under submission to the chief shepherd, Jesus. And so these people who are going through this and experiencing these things together, they need to be led. And they're to be led in a certain way under the authority of a certain chief shepherd. But then looking beyond just the elder pastors here in this paragraph, everyone else, especially the younger, it says here, should be willing to subject themselves to those leading them, as verse 5 says. And to do this, everyone has to clothe themselves with humility toward one another. And if they won't, and thereby exhibit this pride that's resisting that, they should know that God opposes the proud. And so this is really the flow that he's giving to us. And I want to focus on the second half of this passage as we have here in verse 5. We're going to talk about verse 5 tonight. And what I want us to see is that from this verse, within this context, we in the flock have to choose to submit and cooperate with our leaders and with each other. We are commanded here to submit and to cooperate. And we can't just talk about what the shepherd's responsibilities are. We have to talk about ours as well. So in our time and place, and because we're human also, we don't want to have to be subject to anybody. But the apostle is demonstrating to us the need for this, for one thing, in order to have harmony in the church. that this is the way that things go if you are to do what you're supposed to do and get through this situation that you're trying to navigate through. And so the apostle is demonstrating that there is a job here, there is a job there. So we have to have order and harmony in the church and do certain things, especially when times are tough. And so the instructions to the elders, he says all of this in verses 1 through 3. And then in verse 4, he tells them, and when the chief shepherd appears, then you will receive the unfading crown of glory. And so then verse 5 goes in a different direction, but he starts this off by saying, likewise, or in the same way. So we're not talking about something new. He's continuing what he's already been talking about. And he's used this before in the letter where he says, servants, obey your masters and do this in your specific context. In the same way, wives, you need to do this in your context. And so the commands given in this verse, we see, subject yourself to your leaders, clothe yourselves with humility toward each other, and then he gives us the reason for those commands. But in saying likewise or in the same way, Peter indicates he's continuing the same subject, which is that he's addressed the role of the elders, and now he speaks to the flock on the other side of the equation. So this is your job. So I want to look at each of these in turn tonight. So the idea of submission, the idea of clothing ourselves in humility, and then the reason for that he gives there in the later part of the verse. But we look at this, he says, submit yourselves to the elders, or be subject. And I should note that those of you using the King James, it'll say to the elder. It is actually a plural in the original, and so that could give us the idea that it's just talking about old people, right? But in the context, it is talking about the role of a shepherd. So it's not just talking about those who are older as opposed to the younger, but it is talking about the elders together. And he specifies here in verse 5, likewise you who are younger, be subject to the elders. This always catches my attention. There was just at one point several years ago where I feel like I recognized this for the first time, and I went, oh man, I don't know how well I'm doing that. But there's the question of who exactly are they that we're talking about with this idea of the younger. And so the options are that it's literally younger in age for some reason, or that it's a generalization because the flock tends to be younger than the elders, and that's sort of where that term came from, right? But in the context, I think he is singling out the younger people. And a couple of our versions will have younger men, but there's not really any reason to specify men versus women in this context. It is really just talking about younger people. And he says, you in particular need to listen to this. And I think it's probably he's specifying the younger because it's a more natural problem for those of us who are younger to submit. We have phrases like, sow your wild oats and your rebellious years and all those kinds of things because we understand that sometimes with youth comes this propensity to act in a certain way. And so a way that we could rephrase this that I think would help to understand how it's fitting together is he says, be subject to your elders, especially you younger people who might have a harder time with that. But it's not excluding anyone, but we're identifying those who might have a little bit of a difficulty with this. And this makes me think of a lot of situations that I've heard about in the last couple years. It's becoming more common, and you might have heard of situations like this as well, where you have younger families in a congregation, and I'm thinking 45 and under, who become frustrated with the way that they perceive that their shepherds are failing. And so they approach their shepherds and essentially make a lot of demands, and things don't change, and so then they leave for other congregations. And I've heard of several instances of this within just the last year, where the younger people are saying, we want things differently, and when they feel as if they're not heard, they leave. And those are complex situations. I'm not saying they're not complex. But there is seeming to be this uptick in the tendency of those who are younger in the church not wanting to stay and to submit to their leadership. Because in the situations that I'm thinking of, as far as I know, none of them concern any blatant error or sin. It was a difference of opinions and wants and things like that. So there is seeming to be this resurgence in this problem of the younger in the church not wanting to take direction. I'd say that as one of the people of that group, right? I understand that. And I wonder if that is in part due to some of the cultural attitudes that we've adopted. Younger people, I even see, are getting more and more to the point where we don't want you to tell us to do anything. Whether it's at work, at church, at home, leave me alone. And that's just a fact of our culture. And so we need to be thinking about those kinds of things. Is that how we should respond, younger people, when we feel that we're not getting our way, that we just jump ship? And we need to think about things like that. But also, wider, does this command only apply to the younger? And so I've already given you my understanding of this, that I think he is specifying the younger while talking to everybody, because this is usually a problem for younger people, especially younger men, I think. But definitely this is still in the context of shepherd-flock relations. And in the next sentence, he is going to make it even more general of, this is what all of you need to be doing. Peter's probably pointing to a group, again, who's going to have a particular problem with it, but I think Peter appears to be talking specifically to the younger people, but with the rest of the congregation in view as well. Because we would have to make an argument as to why this applies to the young people, but not to the rest of the group. And I don't think there is an argument that can be made as to why the young people need to submit to the leadership, but the older people don't need to submit to the leadership. That's contrary, I think, to what Scripture teaches. But submitting, really, submit to them. To understand this, we need to look at this term. And so the versions most of us have will either be using be subject to or submit yourselves. And the word's used in a lot of different contexts, and common ways to express it, depending on the context, is to obey something or someone, to submit to be under someone or something. And Peter has used this word throughout the letter. So I want to draw your attention to these so that you can see that there's this pattern, and this is not popping up out of nowhere. So turn over to chapter 2 and verse 13, because I want you to see this repetition with your own eyes. So in chapter 2 and verse 13, he says, be subject, the same word, for the Lord's sake to every human institution, whether it be to the emperor as supreme or to governors as sent by him. So be subject, be in submission to governing authorities. And then jump down to verse 18. Servants, be subject to your masters. Same word. Be subject to your masters with all respect, not only to the good and gentle, but also to the unjust. And then if we jump down to chapter 3 and verse 1, he says, likewise, wives, be subject, same word, to your own husbands. So he's setting this up, that there is a pattern of subjection and submission for someone living the life of a Christian. And then we also have another occurrence of it, although obviously with a little bit of a different reference here. In chapter 3 and verse 22, talking about Jesus, and it says that he has gone into heaven and is at the right hand of God with angels, authorities, and powers having been subjected to him. Same word. So we put these together. If we are taking Peter's message as a whole, We're supposed to be subject to the government. We get that. They're supposed to be servants subject to their masters. They're supposed to be wives subject to their husbands. Jesus has things subjected to him. So in the same way that in these other situations we would see the responsibility to submit ourselves, Peter says it's also our responsibility to follow and to submit to the leaders in our church. The same sort of way. That's the pattern that he sets up for us. So for all of us in a local flock, we are to submit ourselves willingly. It's a command. Nowhere does it say here that elders must make everyone submit to them. It does not say that. It says that we have to make that decision. We have to follow that command. And that idea of submitting ourselves to our shepherds is consistent with commands elsewhere in Scripture. And the one that I think most clearly comes to mind, at least for me, is Hebrews 13:17, which says really a lot of the same things in a different way. And so the Hebrew writer says, "Obey your leaders and submit to them." These are different words. "For they are keeping watch over your souls, as those who will have to give an account. Let them do this with joy and not with groaning, for that would be of no advantage to you." And so he gives this command. Again, and this one is more general. This is not specified to the younger people, which is one of the reasons I think this is what Peter's talking about. Obey your leaders and submit to them. The reason is that they have been entrusted with a responsibility of watching over your souls. And they are going to have to answer for how they did that. So don't make it hard for them, is his point here. Don't make it hard for them. Don't resist it. Follow and submit. Because why would you want to make this responsibility difficult? There's no interest for you in that. They are doing hard work, some of the hardest work there is. And I will tell you, as someone who gets a peek behind the curtain every so often, I do not envy it at all. I don't. There are a lot of things that go unseen that your shepherds do, that you may not realize, that they lose sleep over, that they have pains over. So let's not make it harder. That's what the Hebrew writer tells us. And so when we think about these ideas here of submitting ourselves to our leaders in ways of how we can apply this, I think it needs to be said, this might sound harsh, but what is being expressed is not think about if you want to submit to your leaders, but it's your obligation to be subject to them. We're not given a choice, flock, because this is the way that the Lord has structured his body, that we are commanded to follow, to submit. And so there doesn't really, in either 1 Peter 5 or Hebrews chapter 13 there's not any caveats as to, well, I didn't pick them or I don't like what they're doing. I don't see that anywhere. What I do see is the responsibility to follow and to be led. But Peter's words, of course, show, especially to those of us who are younger, that we should not be resisting, we should not be complaining. We need to make the choice to follow. Now, of course, when we're talking about this, that does not remove accountability from the shepherds. In no way is that the case. It doesn't mean that we can't have concerns or that we can't express things. It doesn't mean that the elders are untouchable. If there's sin or there's error, they are accountable to us as they are accountable to the chief shepherd. But the balance in the passage is, here's the elder's role, and here is the flock's role. And in that exercise that I gave at the beginning, I thought about the fact that growing up in the church, I could pretty much quote that part to the elders. But again, I don't think it was until a few years ago when I recognized the other side of the scale. If there are concerns, we need to discuss them. If there are things that we're worried about, we need to talk with them. But the command for us in the flock is to follow. Again, that doesn't mean that there's no accountability. That doesn't mean that we follow blindly whatever they say, even if it's sinful. But we are to be led. And then Peter talks to all of us together at the end of verse 5, where he says, "Clothe yourselves, all of you, with humility toward one another." So he's talked to the elders. He's talked to, I think, everybody, specifically looking at the younger. And now he's broadened it to, this is for all of you. Clothe yourselves with humility toward one another. So we have to be humble to one another. Elder, younger, in between, all of you. This is what you need to do. And again, the language is not saying the elders must humble the flock. They must make them be humble toward each other. It's saying the sheep must choose to humble themselves. This is an action that you do in clothing yourself. And there's been many authors that suggest that the picture here is taking the apron of a servant and choosing to tie it on yourself. Clothing yourself in the humility of service like that. So we are supposed to put on humility that is directed toward one another. He says here, with humility toward one another. It's not just I'm a humble person, but how I interact with you, how I interact with my shepherds is supposed to be clothed in humility. And so we're not trying to make each other submit to our individual will and have everybody do everything how I want it to be done and listen to everything that I have to say, but to be humble with the attitude of mutual submission toward one another. And so when you take that and you put that back in those respective roles that Peter's talking about, the elders must humble themselves as servant leaders under the chief shepherd. And the younger must humble themselves in subjection to their leaders. And all of us have to humble ourselves in subjection to one another. So the inter-flock relations here of this, I think, possibly suffering people, imagine how it would go if people were not following these commands. If the shepherds are trying to lead the flock through this tough situation, and the young people don't want to take their directions, and people don't want to submit and serve one another, how is that going to go? So I saw one author say that humility is the oil that makes the machine run. And I think that's the right idea here. That what Peter is talking about is this is how you achieve this harmony in the group. This is their role. This is your role. This is what all of you need to be doing to get this thing moving. This is how it works. So it wouldn't go well unless everyone mutually humbles themselves toward one another. And the reason that we're given for choosing humility is this last part of verse 5. Notice that Peter says, humility toward one another for, or because, God opposes the proud, but gives grace to the humble. The New Testament writers give a lot of attention to this proverb. This is from Proverbs chapter 3. And it says that God stands against those who act in pride. And because we're so familiar with it, I don't know if we get the full weight, but God is the enemy of the person who is proud. That is a scary thing. So God stands against those who act in pride against others. The reason for choosing humility is for God's favor here, for having things the way that He wants them to be. And so what would this look like? We're trying to think about examples. What would it look like for someone to be acting pridefully in this regard, sort of in this context? Well, I think there's a lot of course, different examples, but certain thoughts that we can think about. If an elder was to say, I don't care what they think, or don't they know who's in charge? That would be acting with that prideful attitude that Peter is warning against. Those sort of ideas. If for the flock, it would say, well, I don't like it and I'm not going to do it. Or I'm not going to listen to what they have to say, or they can't tell me what to do. That would be the attitude manifested in a member of the flock. So there's a lot of different things that we could think about. Well, the elders are essentially, in that case, saying, I'm in charge and I don't care what anybody says, and they're going to do what I tell them to do. And on the other side, for the flock to behave in this way of pride is to say, we're not going to listen, and we don't care what you have to say. I'm not going to follow your directions. I'm not going to go along with it. But I hope we see the warning here. If we choose not to humble ourselves toward one another, if we choose not to follow our leaders, God will be against us. There's no way to escape that in this verse. If we choose not to humble ourselves toward each other, if we choose not to follow our leaders, God becomes our enemy. So Peter clearly lays out these behavioral commands and the correct attitudes, which gives the reason for these commands. And this is something that we need to think about, because we as a people today, just very generally, have an issue with submission. We're liberated and we have all of these civil freedoms, and we don't want anyone to tell us what to do. And it's getting worse. We don't listen to the doctors. We don't listen to the government. We don't listen to the experts. We don't want anyone telling us what to do or what to believe. And we need to realize that those attitudes will naturally work themselves into the church if we don't stand against them. And I thought about this, and I don't know how true this is, so take it for what it's worth. In some ways, this exercise, or whatever you want to call it, exercise or practice of submission, I think, is our evidence of our submission to God. So the way that I show that my life is given in subjection to God is how I express that in the different areas of my life. And as I'm saying that, I'm like, yeah, that sounds good. And I think that's the argument of 1 Peter. So maybe that's why I thought of it. But in some ways, yes, it's the practical evidence of the fact that we are submitting our lives to God. And we could say it would be easy for someone to look at this verse in isolation and claim that it's oppressive. This is how, they control everybody, or however you want to voice that. But look at the full context, that this is a balancing of mutual responsibilities, complementary roles. And we talk about the fact that a leader without any followers is just taking a long walk by themselves, and you can flip that of what does it look like when there's a whole bunch of people with nobody to lead them. God knew what he was doing. And this is the way that he wants things to look. Elders of a congregation, they have a responsibility to lead in certain ways. And the congregation has a responsibility to follow in certain ways. If we are rejecting that, if we're resistant to that, that shows a heart attitude that is really the problem. If I'm not wanting to take direction, if I'm not wanting to listen to what anyone says, if I want to insist on my own way, then there is a deeper issue that's there. And that's what Peter's talking about here. These behaviors are supposed to be motivated by a certain kind of attitude, a certain kind of heart posture. So what I want you to do in walking away from this is, for one, to realize our mutual responsibilities. We all have a responsibility in the dynamic of how this works, in the oil that makes the machine go, as one author said it. So we need to pray for our leaders. As I said, it's not an easy job, and I'll say it this way, and I don't think you'll misunderstand me. It's not a fun job either. But it is a great one. And I don't mean job is to denigrate it in any sense. But pray for them. And naturally, if you don't think they're doing a good job, pray for them. If you think they're doing a good job, pray for them. That is the way that we can do our part in making this better and helping them to develop and doing their role and us following our roles. And then also we have to willingly follow. Willingly follow them, help them, accept direction. Even if you don't understand something, be willing to submit and to go. That's what we see Peter teaching us here. And I'll say, the elders had no idea I was going to say any of this today. So they didn't put me up to it. There's no gun to my back right now. This is our responsibility. So we need to reflect on our own attitudes and our actions. Have I been resistant? Have I been prideful? Are there ways that I can improve in helping them to fulfill their role? Or maybe asking them to help me fulfill my role. And if there's something that I have done that shows a problem, then I need to repent of that. I need to make it right. Whether that's publicly or privately, whatever you need to do, make that right. And as I'm looking, unless I'm missing someone, and I dearly apologize for that, we are all part of the fold here right now. So as Peter is telling us, we've got a job to do. And we can't just quote 1 Peter 5 in the first 3 verses to tell the elders what to do. Peter says that we have a role as the flock also, and it's to follow, to help them, to make the job easier. So that is what we need to do. Pray for them, follow them, help each other, be humble toward one another. Because that is the way that God has built this to be. If you need help with anything tonight, from the rest of your fellow sheep or your shepherds, then you know that there are people who are willing and wanting to help you. Whether you choose to do that as we sing or choose to do that afterward, please be thinking about that while Andrew leads us in this song.